This video will be the first in a series that addresses what is called the association theory of political obligation. The main proponent of association theory is Ronald Dworkin, one of the most significant legal philosophers. On the question of political obligation, Dworkin argues that there is a moral obligation to obey the law that's patterned after the obligation to obey the rules of an organization or an association that one belongs to. Before getting into Dworkin's theory of political obligation specifically, we should begin by noting that for Dworkin, all questions of law and morality are related. One can't meaningfully discuss questions of political obligation without talking at the same time about questions of the objectivity of value, the relevance of free will, theories of punishment, theories of culpability, and the like. They're all related. To illustrate this idea of unification, Dworkin makes repeated reference to a proverb concerning a fox and a hedgehog. The statement is that a fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one big thing. In other words, most philosophers are foxes who have separate and distinct theories regarding the many topics of investigation and morality and law. Dworkin, being a philosophical hedgehog, wants to capture everything in one big idea. So for Dworkin, the question of political obligation, whether there's an obligation to obey the law, is tied in with the question of legitimate political authority. In order for the government to legitimately use coercion to enforce the law, people must have an obligation to obey the law. In other words, if there's no obligation to obey the law, then the government can't legitimately arrest and convict people for violating the law. We can illustrate this link between having an obligation and the legitimacy of condemnation or criticism by looking at promises. You can condemn people for breaking a promise, but only when they had an obligation to keep their promise. If there was no obligation to keep the promise, then one can't be justified in condemning people for a failure to keep their promise. If there's no obligation to obey the law, then there's no legitimate punishment of people who break the law. So, is there an obligation to obey the law? Well, can the government legitimately enforce the law? For Dworkin, these two questions must have the same answer. You can't reasonably answer yes to one and no to the other. Dworkin wrote, quote, "A general theory of law presupposes a solution to a complex set of simultaneous equations having to do with both the grounds and the force of law," end quote. So then, to work out these simultaneous equations, Dworkin gives us a detailed account of what is meant by the grounds of law, that is, what is it that makes it the case that something is illegal, and the force of law. What is it that makes it the case that we have an obligation to obey the law? So let's look at this distinction between the grounds of law and the force of law. We'll look at the grounds of law first. To explain the grounds of law, Harry states, quote, "The grounds of law are the truth conditions of propositions of the form, it is the law of some specified jurisdiction, that A, where A is a normative proposition that states that some person or group of persons has some normative status. For example, that they have an obligation, right, permission, liability, or power," end quote. So now, what does all this jargon mean? Well, you're driving down the street. You come to an intersection with a stop sign. Can you legally, and I mean legally here, we're talking about the law, can you legally drive through the intersection without stopping? Well, what if a bunch of kids put the stop sign up as a joke? Or they're filming a movie and the stop sign is a prop that's there because the script requires it. In this type of case, it wouldn't be illegal to ignore the stop sign. But if the Boulder City Council voted to put up the stop sign and enforce it, then it would be illegal. So let's see if we can use this example to make sense of this quote. The proposition A in our example would be something like the following. All drivers have an obligation to come to a full stop and to yield to traffic and pedestrians before proceeding into the specified intersection. The grounds of law are what it would take for this proposition to be made true. If a bunch of kids put up a sign as a joke, that wouldn't ground an obligation. That's not a legitimate way to make law. If it's a movie prop, that wouldn't create an obligation either. That's not a legitimate way to make law. But if the Boulder City Council voted to put up a sign and enforce it, that, it seems, would create a law. And grounding a law it grounds an obligation to stop and yield to pedestrians and other traffic. Or does it? What if the government passes a law requiring that some group show up for extermination or to become slaves? Can a government create an obligation to show up for extermination or an obligation to submit to slavery? It may seem at first blush that the answer is no. The government cannot create such an obligation to show up for extermination or enslavement. But then, can the government create an obligation to show up for punishment? What if the convicted person is innocent? Can a government create an obligation for an innocent person to show up for punishment if convicted of a crime? Here is where the ground of law meets the force of law. What are the grounding conditions for the city council to create a law that people have an obligation to obey? Considering the fact that a law that commands that a group of people show up for extermination or enslavement would not create an obligation to obey. So now let's look at the other side of the coin, the force of law. Here, Perry writes, quote, "The force of law is its normative force, which means its moral force. The concern when we're speaking about force, in other words, is with the truth or falsity of normative propositions such as everyone has an obligation to do X, when they figure in true propositions such as it is the law that everyone has an obligation to do X." End quote. Returning to our example of a stop sign in Boulder. Obligations have a certain amount of normative force. If you make a promise to help your neighbor move into a new apartment, this obligation comes with a certain amount of moral force, a moral weight that now requires you to help your friend, unless something of greater weight prevents it. So when we look at the proposition A, which is that all drivers have an obligation to come to a full stop at that intersection, if this is a valid law, it brings into existence a certain amount of moral force attached to stopping at the intersection. The legitimate passage of a law, according to the grounds of law, gives the obligation to stop a certain moral weight, in the same way that a promise to help a friend move gives a moral weight to the obligation to help the friend move. So here we see that the grounding of the law, that is, what makes it the case that it's illegal to proceed into the intersection without stopping, is intimately tied to the force of the law, what it takes to create an obligation to stop before going into the intersection. Now, one of the implications of this is that it means that there's no obligation to obey the law where the state can't legitimately create an obligation. There's no obligation to obey a law commanding some group of people to show up for extermination, since there's no way to ground a law that creates such an obligation. So Dworkin's theory does allow for the possibility of there being situations where governments make what some might consider laws that there's no obligation to obey. Nazi Germany with respect to the laws against Jews and other minorities. Apartheid South Africa. The former Soviet Union. And the United States with respect to slave laws and segregation laws. These are cases in which there are laws that there is no obligation to obey. So what I've done in this first video in this series is try to give an initial account of the relationship between political obligation and political legitimacy in the writings of Ronald Dworkin as presented by Stephen Perry. I'm going to stop here for now and cover Dworkin's theory of political obligation as an associative obligation in the next video.